Right now, as you're listening to this, your brain is performing a magic trick so seamless you don't even realize it's happening. Your heart is maintaining a specific rhythm. Your lungs are expanding and contracting based on blood oxygen levels. Your skin is sensing the temperature of the room. Your ears are decoding the background hum of a refrigerator or the traffic outside. And somewhere in the dark archives of your cortex, memories are shifting, consolidating, getting ready for retrieval. But you aren't aware of any of that. You are only aware of my voice. Just one thin stream of data.
Exactly, one thin stream. Out of millions of simultaneous neural events, you get to experience one thing at a time. It raises a terrifyingly simple question. Who or what is the gatekeeper? What decides which signal gets promoted from the darkness into the light? This is the central mystery of the second episode of our series on consciousness. We are leaving the Hall of Mirrors we talked about last time, higher order theory, and stepping onto a stage, a literal stage. Today we are dissecting Global Workspace Theory, the theory that suggests consciousness isn't a special substance or a soul, but a broadcast system. It's the difference between a private whisper and a public announcement. And to help me tear this apart, I'm back with Eloise. In the last episode, we talked about the idea that consciousness is thoughts thinking about thoughts. That was the higher order theory approach. But Global Workspace Theory, let's call it GWT, seems to take a very different mechanical view. It feels less philosophical maybe and more architectural.
It is definitely more architectural, Noah. In fact, Bernard Baars, the cognitive scientist who really cemented this theory in the late 1980s, explicitly used an architectural metaphor. He called it the theater of the mind, and it's such a sticky image because it intuitively matches how we feel inside our heads. Baars argued that you should imagine the mind as a vast, dark theater.
Dark, that's the default state.
Right. Most of the theater is in total darkness. This represents the unconscious, the basement, the wings, the backstage area. That's where all the heavy lifting happens. Your syntax processing, your motor control, regulating your heartbeat, your long-term memory retrieval. All those workers are in the dark, doing their jobs silently. But on the stage, there is a single bright spotlight.
The spotlight of attention.
Precisely. Now, the stage itself represents your working memory, the things you can hold in your mind right now. But the stage is actually quite small. The spotlight is even smaller. According to GWT, consciousness is simply whatever happens to be in that spotlight at this exact second. If an actor, let's say the smell of coffee, steps into the spotlight, you become conscious of it. If it steps out, back into the shadows, the processing might still continue, but you simply cease to experience it.
So consciousness is just illumination. It's a selection mechanism.
It's a selection and dissemination mechanism. This is the crucial part that people often miss about Baars' metaphor. A spotlight on a stage is useless if there's nobody watching the play. In GWT, there is an audience, but the audience isn't you. The audience is the rest of the unconscious brain. The language center, the emotional centers, the motor cortex, they're all sitting in the dark watching the stage. When the spotlight hits the smell of coffee, that information is broadcast to the entire audience instantly. So now the language center says, I can describe this. The memory center says, this reminds me of mornings in Paris. The motor cortex says, I should reach for the mug.
That's a very functional definition. It implies that the only reason we are conscious is to coordinate the zombies in the basement. We broadcast a signal so that all the different unconscious modules can sync up.
Exactly. Stanislas Dehaene, a neuroscientist who has really taken Baars' psychological theory and found the neural correlates for it, describes it as fame in the brain. Consciousness is just neural fame. When a piece of information becomes famous, everyone in the brain knows about it. If it's not famous, it's just local gossip in a dark corner.
Okay, Fame in the Brain is a great band name, but I want to get into the nuts and bolts of this. You mentioned Stanislas Dehaene. He's done a lot of work using fMRI and EEG to actually catch this moment of fame happening. Hasn't he? Because that's the promise of GWT. It's not just a metaphor. It claims to be a biological reality.
It is very empirically grounded. Dehaene and his colleagues have identified what they call the global neuronal workspace. They've found that when you process something unconsciously, like a word that flashes too fast for you to consciously see, the brain activity is local. It stays in the visual cortex. It fizzles out. But if that word stays on screen just a few milliseconds longer, something drastic happens. You get what they call ignition.
Ignition, like an engine starting?
More like an explosion or an avalanche. Activity doesn't just stay in the visual area. It suddenly erupts and spreads to the prefrontal cortex and the parietal lobes, the long distance networks. It's a massive synchronization event. The whole brain lights up in a coordinated way. And here's the kicker, Noah. This ignition doesn't happen instantly. There is a lag.
A lag? How long?
About 300 milliseconds. It's marked by a specific brainwave called the P300. This suggests that for the first third of a second after anything happens to you, you are technically a zombie. Your brain is processing the light and sound, but you, the conscious observer, haven't arrived yet. You are always living in the past, waiting for the broadcast to begin.
That is unsettling. So real time isn't real. We're on a tape delay. But this ignition idea explains something I've always wondered about multitasking. If consciousness is this massive, energy-expensive broadcast, that explains why we can't do two things at once, right? The spotlight can't be in two places.
That's one of the strongest arguments for a GWT. It explains the bottleneck. If consciousness were just local processing, why couldn't I do a complex math problem while simultaneously composing a poem? My brain has enough neurons for both. But if consciousness is a global broadcast system, you can't have two competing broadcasts on the same channel. It would be noise. You need the single spotlight to unite the system.
It feels like we're describing a computer operating system, like a CPU that can only process one thread at a time. So it switches rapidly between tasks to give the illusion of continuity, which brings me to a weird connection. This sounds a lot like simulation theory, the idea that reality is a rendered simulation. In video games, the engine only renders what the player is looking at. It doesn't waste computing power rendering the street behind you.
That is a fantastic analogy. In GWT, the brain is an efficiency machine. It's expensive to keep the whole theater lit up. So it runs a cheap, low-resolution background process for everything else, heartbeat, posture, background noise, and only spends the expensive energy rendering the high-resolution experience of what is in the spotlight. It's resource management.
But here is where I start to have a problem with this, Eloise. And it's the same problem I had with higher order theory, but from a different angle. GWT explains the function of consciousness perfectly. I get it. Broadcasting allows for reportability. I can tell you I see a red apple. If the signal wasn't broadcast to the language center, I couldn't speak it. But it doesn't explain the feeling.
The hard problem rears its ugly head.
It has to. Look, I can build a computer network where a central server broadcasts a packet of data to 1,000 terminals. The terminals all receive it and act on it. That is a global workspace. But does the server feel sad? Does it experience the redness of the apple? GWT seems to conflate access with experience. Just because the information is everywhere, why does it feel like something?
This is the primary philosophical criticism of global workspace theory. It's often called the empty theater objection. You can have the stage, the actors, the spotlight, and the audience. But is there actually anyone sitting in the seats experiencing the play? Or is it just a mechanical loop of information moving from point A to point B? GWT proponents, particularly the more hardcore illusionists like Daniel Dennett, would argue that the feeling is just a user illusion.
A user illusion?
Yes, they would say you are looking for a ghost in the machine that doesn't exist. They'd argue that once information is globally accessible, once it's igniting the workspace, that is the feeling. There isn't a magical extra step where feeling is added like a sauce on top of the data. The broadcasting is the feeling. If you think there's something more, you're just falling for the magic trick.
I find that so hard to accept. It feels like gaslighting by my own neurology. You're not really feeling pain, Noah. You're just broadcasting nociceptive data to your motor cortex.
Well, let's look at the alternative. If we go back to the spiritual traditions for a second, and I know we try to keep this scientific, but the parallel is striking. Many traditions say awareness is the container. Awareness is the sky, and thoughts are just clouds passing through. GWT flips that completely upside down. It says there is no sky. There are only clouds. And when a cloud gets dense enough and bright enough, it briefly creates the illusion of a sky around it.
That's a beautiful and depressing image. Consciousness as a momentary byproduct of data density. But let's go back to the comparison with the last episode. Higher order theory said, I am conscious because I know that I know. GWT says, I am conscious because the information is everywhere. These seem like they're solving different problems.
They are. And honestly, they might be describing different aspects of the same system. HOT is very good at explaining metacognition, that complex human level reflection. GWT is much better at explaining basic sensory awareness and attention. You can imagine a dog having a global workspace. A dog sees a squirrel. That image ignites its brain, it chases. The dog has the spotlight. But does the dog have the higher order thought, I am currently viewing a squirrel? Maybe not. So GWT might be the foundation, the operating system, and HOT is the software running on top.
That distinction, the dog chasing the squirrel, actually helps me with the functional side. The dog needs the global workspace to coordinate its legs, its bark, and its eyes all at once. If the squirrel data stayed in the visual cortex, the legs wouldn't know to run. So the broadcast is evolutionarily essential for survival.
Absolutely. It's about integration. Without the workspace, you're a collection of reflexes. With the workspace, you're a unified agent. And this brings us to where GWT is really being tested right now. AI. If GWT is correct and consciousness is just a specific architecture of information sharing, then we can build it.
Right. We aren't trying to code a soul. We're just coding a global workspace.
There are computer scientists doing exactly this. They are building AI architectures with a blackboard system, a central hub where different modules write information and read from it. If Daheen is right, if we build a machine with a sufficiently complex global workspace where modules compete for attention and ignite a central broadcast, that machine should, theoretically, wake up.
And that is where the distinction between simulation and reality blurs. If I simulate a hurricane on a computer, nobody gets wet. But if I simulate a global workspace, does the computer get conscious? GWT implies the answer is yes, which is either thrilling or terrifying, depending on how much sci-fi you read.
It's terrifying because it suggests consciousness is cheap. It's just a trick of the light. But it's also robust. It explains why damage to the brain, specifically the hub areas like the prefrontal cortex, can degrade consciousness so severely. If you break the projector, the movie stops. It doesn't matter how good the film reel is.
So to wrap this up, GWT gives us the stage. It gives us the spotlight. It explains why we can't multitask, why we have a lag time, and how our different brain parts talk to each other. It's a brilliant theory of access.
It's the best theory we have for the mechanics of awareness.
But it leaves the theater empty. It doesn't tell us who is enjoying the show. It tells us how the light turns on, but not why the light feels warm. And that persistent gap, that failure to explain the quality of experience, is leading us to a much more radical theory in the next episode.
Right. We're going to move from the idea of consciousness as a process, something the brain does, to the idea of consciousness as a property, something the universe has.
Integrated information theory. That is a whole different beast. But for now, take a moment to notice the spotlight in your own mind. What's on stage right now? And more importantly, what are you ignoring? If this conversation sparked a little ignition in your own workspace, send it to a friend who likes to think about things.
Embark on a journey through the unknown in pursuit of the ultimate truth. Discover Iris. Visit emmetpublications.com.